We're delighted to have Professor New back here at the Wilson Center. He was a public policy scholar here in 2007. He received his BA from Northwestern University and his PhD from Harvard. Professor of history at Brown University from 1970 to 2003, and since 2004 has been adjunct professor of history at the University of Miami. He's written, co-edited, and edited a long list of books. Let me just name a few of them. An Uncertain Friendship, Theodore Roosevelt in Japan, The Troubled Encounter, the United States and Japan, The Wilson Era, Essays in Honor of Arthur Link, After Vietnam, Legacies of a Lost War, America's Lost War, Vietnam, 1945 to 1975, and Artists of Power, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, and their enduring legacy, their enduring impact on U.S. foreign policy, published in 2006. And of course, again, today we're celebrating and discussing and debating the new biography of Colonel House. And with that, you have the floor.
Thank you, Christian. And my thanks to the National History Center and the Woodrow Wilson Center for organizing this event. And I'm especially grateful to the Wilson Center, where I've had two very productive stays over the years. And thanks to all of you for coming today in what, from my perspective, is kind of a gloomy day. But when we flew up Sunday in Miami, it was in the high 80s and sunny. So what I want to do today is talk about some of the major themes of this biography and touch upon some of the major challenges in writing it too. Because what I try to do is to explain this extraordinary rise of Colonel House from his youth in Texas to when he was a leader of a faction of the Texas Democratic Party, perhaps the dominant faction. Then he becomes a presidential advisor, and then he becomes the Wilson administration's chief diplomatic emissary abroad. And he eventually becomes, by the time of the Paris Peace Conference, really a famous statesman, famous in this country and in Western Europe. And he's a person who really knew all of the leaders of the great European powers, or at least the leaders of England and of Germany and of France. And he ended up knowing those leaders far better than Woodrow Wilson. In fact, Walter Lippmann, during the Paris Peace Conference, did an interesting piece on Americans who were at the Paris Peace Conference, and Lippmann remarked that there were really four people who Europeans knew very well. One of those, of course, was Woodrow Wilson, another was Herbert Hoover, another was General John Pershing, and the fourth was Colonel House. And so what I hope this biography does is the study of Colonel House's life. I hope it deepens our understanding of Wilson's presidency, which was such a crucial period of war and reform and revolution. And we saw this effort of which House was very much a part to build a new world order under American leadership. And what I've tried to do in this book is to draw the reader back to what I think is a very distant and a very different period of American history. You know, after all, most of the events I talk about in this book occurred roughly 100 years ago. So what I try to do is give some context to the European side of things and to the American side of things as well, and to paint a fairly large canvas, not too large a canvas, I hope, but a fairly large canvas to give a sense of the great events against which House's life took place. And so I spent a fair amount of time trying to understand the way in which the major belligerent governments, the British, the French, the German governments, the way in which they function, to try to understand why the war broke out in August of 1914 and why it continued for so long, why it was so difficult to end that struggle, why it grew in scale and in intensity. And then I also tried to explain the nature of House's life, to try to recreate the rhythms of his life, which were kind of unique, his migratory pattern, the texture of his life, and to try to remind the reader that this was a time of a lot of slow trains, of of long ocean voyages, of letters and diaries. The number of letters that Wilson and House wrote is simply extraordinary. House's diary, I'll talk about that a bit later, but it totaled by the end nearly 3,000 pages. Leisurely conversations of a nation which was, I think, smaller and less cohesive than it is certainly today, of an American government so small in scale that Wilson wrote many of his own diplomatic notes, and of diplomatic missions, or at least House's diplomatic missions. They lasted not days or weeks, but months, 2, 3, sometimes even longer. Just to give you one example, in early 1915, the end of January 1915, House went on what was his third major diplomatic mission to Europe. He didn't get back until the middle of June. That was 4.5 months. But the only reason he came back in the middle of June was because of the sinking of the Lusitania in early May of that year, and because he was worried about Wilson's response. He wanted to make sure the president responded in a suitably vigorous way. Otherwise, had it not been for the sinking of the Lusitania, he would have stayed in Europe until sometime in the autumn. He planned an extensive round of travels in northern Europe, and he planned to get all the way to Russia. And it's too bad that he didn't, that he had to get back early, because it would have been fascinating to see what House's reactions were to Nicholas II and the rulers of Russia. He had actually rented a house in London so he could stay at a more reasonable cost. Now, the first I cover in the book, in the biography, I cover the first 53 years of House's life fairly quickly. It takes only about 50 pages to take him to his 53rd birthday. It takes only about 50 pages until he meets Woodrow Wilson in November of 1911. And that's because the sources for this kind of first 50 years of his life are fairly thin. The sources on House's early years, we don't really know very much about them. We know a bit more about his years in Texas politics. For someone who is so almost obsessed about his place in history, House behaved sometimes in very odd ways. In the early months of 1914, he went back to Texas. He had built there in the early 1890s a simply magnificent mansion, a kind of Richardsonian-style mansion with red sandstone foundations and chimneys. And he and his private secretary, Fanny Denton, decided if he had sold the house, he had to move all of his belongings out of it. They decided to go through his Texas correspondence, thousands of letters, and they threw away a lot of stuff. Why he did that, I will never know. And then later on in his life, he regretted, I think, having done that. In any event, so the material on the first 50-odd years of his life is rather thin. Then on September 25 of 1912, he begins his diary. And of course, he keeps all of his letters for the period after 1911, 1912. So we know much, much more about this later phase of his life, and the pace of the narrative slows down. Now let me just move very quickly through House's early and middle years, and then move on to really the heart of this biography, which is really his relationship to Woodrow Wilson. House was born into a very wealthy and prominent Houston family. His father was one of the great entrepreneurs of mid-19th century Texas history, the Rangers, the Cowboys, the Ruthless Killers. As a youth, he played with loaded guns, thought nothing of doing so, and his older brother, T.W., actually had a terrible accident when he was young, in which he shot off part of the left side of his face, and I had a photograph of that, but I couldn't make space for it in the photographs in the book. In any event, House was caught up with this kind of mystique of violence of post-Civil War Texas. He was fascinated by it, and somewhere along these post-Civil War years, he became a man of destiny. He spent many days traveling through the Gulf coastal plain, hunting, camping out, and he began to have, by his own admission, these romantic dreams of his place in history, or as he put it, I dreamed great dreams. And he was, after all, close to the heroic age of Texas history, to the Revolutionary War of Texas, to the Alamo, to San Jacinto. And there was no way, given the time he was growing up in, he could duplicate the feats of this revolutionary generation of Texans. And so at some point during his youth, and again, the evidence here is fairly shadowy, he began to reshape his ambitions to fit his talents. As a young man, and later, House was fascinated with people. He was fascinated with the way in which he could master and manipulate the emotions of other people. And he enjoyed, by his own admission, creating situations in which he possessed a kind of special knowledge and in which he could kind of control the ebb and flow of the emotions of other people. Or he liked to play practical jokes, especially jokes that involved a kind of flirtation with violence and with death. And when he was an old man, the only reason we know about all of this is because when he was a fairly old man in 1929, he dictated an autobiographical fragment called Memories, in which he detailed in kind of loving detail many of these pranks and jokes he had undertaken when he was an undergraduate at Cornell. There he was a member of a fraternity, and he carried out some of these pranks against pledges. They were his victims. One he was particularly fond of, in which he and a friend, they blindfolded one of these pledges. They took him to the main line of a railway. They didn't tie him to the main line, they tied him to a side track. And then as the train began to come along, things were shaking, and they could hear the whistle. And House's friend said, shouldn't we begin to untie him? And House said, oh no, let's wait a little longer. We have plenty of time. And then they frantically tried to undo the knots, and of course they were all thumbs. They jumped back as the train came back down on the main line. And he obviously wanted anyone who became his biographer to know that he had engaged in pranks of this sort. And so perhaps it made sense that in the early 1890s, in 1892 precisely, House began to turn his attention to politics. But as he did so, he began to realize that he lacked some of the qualities that were essential for success in late 19th century Texas politics, which required an enormous amount of stamina, among other things. House was not that kind of man. He was not the kind of man of his great mentor in Texas politics, Governor James Stephen Hogg. He was small, he was delicate. He only weighed throughout most of his adult life around 126 pounds. He had a receding chin, a very soft voice, a very small, expressive hands. He convinced himself that he had frail health and that he could not pursue a kind of normal political career. He was convinced that he had a heat phobia, that he could not stand the severe heat of Texas or even of other parts of the country. And so, instead of actually running for the governorship of Texas or trying to move into a U.S. Senate seat in Texas, which he surely could have done, he decided that he'd become a kind of behind-the-scenes political operator and become the leader of a faction of the Texas Democratic Party, probably the dominant faction of the Texas Democratic Party in the 1890s. And so he became an advisor to 4 governors. He became extraordinarily successful in his promotion of these governors and of some other Texas politicians. And he assembled a group of associates and protégés. He called them our crowd. And they were held together by bonds of patronage, and I think in part by the magnetism of House's personality. To these associates who were members of our crowd, he seemed a wise and a shrewd and a very calm man. He seemed above many of the petty passions and ambitions of the time. And the members of our crowd formed kind of bonds of affection and loyalty which really lasted, in many cases, all of their lives. Now, by 1900, by the turn of the century, House was tired of his life in Texas, not only of his political life, but of his personal life as well. And he developed this kind of migratory pattern to his life, always to avoid any kind of extreme heat. He spent his winters, the bulk of his winters now, in New York City, in an apartment there. He would normally travel to Europe in the late spring and early summer. Then he would go to the North Shore of Boston for the remainder of the summer, and he was very careful not to return to New York City until the heat had lifted. He called these years from 1900 to 1911 his twilight years. He felt, I think, a sense of time rushing by. He felt a sense of what he had done and what he hadn't done with his life. And he had this growing fear during these years that time was rushing by and he simply wasn't going to be able to achieve his great ambitions, and that was to become a kind of backroom operator on the national scale. And I think he feared that he was going to have to scale back many of his dreams of fame that he had earlier. And so he waited for what he called the man and the opportunity, and he waited for the emergence of a Democratic leader, someone who could win the presidency and to whom he could attach himself as a political advisor. Now, he knew William Jennings Bryan very well. Bryan spent several summers, or several winters rather, in Austin. And House had decided that Bryan was not a man to whom he could attach himself. First of all, he never thought he was going to win a presidential election, but he also realized that Bryan was simply too self-sufficient. There was no way that House was going to be able to get into Bryan's emotional or intellectual life and really attach himself to him and influence his position on a wide range of policies. And so House, during these years, he traveled a lot, he daydreamed, he escaped into a world of fantasy in which sometimes with his friends, as they were crossing the Atlantic on one of the great ocean liners, that he would pretend he was the Kaiser of Germany, and they would kind of go through the diplomatic maneuvers that might lead to a world war. He wrote a novel of the future, Philip II Administrator, not a very good novel, but one that revealed a fair amount about him. And then on November 24 of 1911, that event took place that really changed House's life dramatically. He met Woodrow Wilson, and that was the great transforming experience in his life. Early on, House asked Wilson if he realized what a short time they had known each other, and Wilson replied, of course, in that famous response, "My dear friend, we have known each other always," and Wilson was soon referring to House as his second personality. Now, House, I think, had three vital roles in this relationship with Wilson, which is really in many ways the heart of this book. One of those was a role of friendship and of companionship. Wilson yearned for male companionship. His last great male friend, John Grier Hibbon at Princeton, had died they had broken off in 1907. Wilson had a wonderful marriage, a warm and happy family life, but he was highly vulnerable to emotional stress, and he had, as I'm sure all of you know, a very complex medical history. He often felt lonely and depressed, and he sometimes, I think, also feared a loss of emotional self-control. And I think that the presidency was a strain for Woodrow Wilson. As Ray Stannard Baker once remarked, Wilson had so many things to do, he could just barely summon the energy to do them and no more. And so House appeared at just the right time in Wilson's life. And he had a combination of personal and political qualities that appealed to Wilson. House had this gentle, unobtrusive, deferential manner. He lacked any kind of assertive or threatening masculinity. He had a way of putting Wilson at his ease, not seeming threatening or competitive. He had a way of assuring Wilson of his affection and of his support. And he always would remind him of the great place Wilson was going to have in the history of his time. And House's apparently fragile health appealed to Wilson. His need to avoid warm weather, the migratory pattern of his life. Wilson never questioned all of this. He was always very sympathetic. He was always very concerned that House ought not to leave the North Shore. He ought not to move back to New York City, or he ought not to go down to Washington until it had cooled off enough so he wouldn't be under any strain. And there's no doubt, I think, that House was impressed with Wilson as a political leader. He had a deep and, I think, a genuine admiration for him, both as a person and as a political leader. House believed in inspired political leadership. He believed that this kind of leadership would help solve the nation's problems and bring about its regeneration. And he found in Woodrow Wilson a man who embodied his moral and political values and who stood for this kind of what some have called oratorical statesmanship. And House seemed the perfect advisor. He was self-effacing, he was a wealthy man of leisure, he made no personal demands on Wilson, he made no demands for any kind of political office. He seemed content to influence his times through the president. And so in the winter of 1912 and 1913, House joined this whole circle of intimates around the president, this group of people who were dedicated to maintaining Wilson's physical health and his emotional stability, and who were dedicated to helping him advance his political career. So this was one of the major roles that House played, this role as of friendship and of companionship. Then secondly, I think that House also began to serve as a high-level political intermediary in the Wilson administration. In other words, he did all kinds of political tasks that Wilson found distasteful or that he simply didn't have enough time for. House's days were filled with long conferences. He would begin around 9 in the morning, often go into the late afternoon or early evening with meeting people, phone calls. By the time Wilson took office, House had a long career as a political advisor and as a professional politician. He was patient. He was a crafty political infighter. He could be very manipulative and very cynical in the way he dealt with people too, and he could also be a shrewd tactician. Now, House was not a well-educated man. He never finished at Cornell. His mind lacked, I think, the depth and the precision of Woodrow Wilson's. But his great strength to the Wilson presidency was in the realm of human relations. He understood, in general, he understood pretty well how people worked. He understood what it was going to take to move someone in a certain direction. He shared their aspirations. He soothed their anxieties. House's genius was Wilson's weakness. And so House spent many days sifting through people and sifting through issues, helping to select officials, helping to rally various constituencies behind Wilson's programs, and helping Wilson achieve his legislative programs. So that was the second role, really this role as a high-level political intermediary. And then thirdly, certainly by 1914, actually a bit before, because House makes his first diplomatic mission to Europe is a very brief one, but it comes in May of 1913. Wilson's only been in office a few months. But House early on begins to focus on diplomacy because he wants to play a major role on the world stage. House values the art of diplomacy, of negotiating with other governmental leaders, and he, maybe not initially, but at some point couple of years down the road of Wilson's presidency, House becomes aware of the fact that if his diplomatic efforts are going to succeed, he needs a certain apparatus to support them. And he actually begins to assemble his own group, his own inner circle of advisors who can help him in his diplomatic efforts as they become more and more complicated. But after August of 1914, after the Great War breaks out, House's influence on Wilson's diplomacy grows a great deal. He is able to outmaneuver. In the fall of 1914, he is able to outmaneuver Secretary of State Bryan and become Wilson's primary foreign policy advisor. And I think he is the first member of the Wilson administration who tries to systematically inform himself about the complexity of the war, about the way in which decisions are made in the major belligerent governments. And he is the first person who really tries to think about the dangers and the opportunities that the war presents for the United States. And I think it's fair to say that House was probably the most cosmopolitan of all of Wilson's foreign policy advisors. And every year of the Great War, he would make a diplomatic mission, a wartime mission to Europe, where he would serve as the president's personal representative, and from which he sent back very detailed reports to Wilson on what was going on in the capitals of Britain and of France and of Germany. Now, I think fairly early on, House and Wilson too realized the damage that the war was inflicting on Western civilization, and they began to think about ways in which they could use the power of the United States to end the war, ways in which they could use American power to transform international relations and build a new world order, and to make the United States the leading power of the 20th century. And so House becomes the really key figure in these wartime American efforts to mediate the war. He is, if anything, he's very inventive in what he tries to do, trying to find a way the United States can use its influence to end the struggle. And it's very hard to kind of follow these efforts, to try to figure out what he's thinking, whether or not he wants a pro-Allied settlement or whether or not he wants an Allied victory, because he kind of moves back and forth from one goal to another. And House, though he's a resourceful diplomat, I felt it's very difficult to judge him. In other words, what level of competence does one expect from a man like House during this period? But there's no doubt, I think, that he had certain serious shortcomings as a negotiator, and that his preparations for high-level diplomacy during the war were fairly careless. He believed too much in person-to-person contacts. He was especially seduced by the leaders of the British government, and his favorite person there was British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey. House and Grey spent many, many long hours together. When they would finish their formal diplomatic conversations, they would talk about bird watching, nature, what it was like to grow up in Texas, English poetry. House believed that Foreign Secretary Grey was nearly as great a man as Woodrow Wilson. So what he did was to overemphasize person-to-person contacts. He exaggerated his own accomplishments in the letters that he wrote to the president. He engaged certainly in a good bit of wishful thinking, in believing what he wanted to see had come true. For example, in 1914, when he was in Europe, and he just left just before the war broke out, House had the notion that when he traveled to Berlin, then he went back to London, and he had the notion that he was going to be able to bring the leaders of the British and the German government to some kind of understanding that would lessen the tension between Germany and Great Britain. He actually believed that he was going to be able to convince the Kaiser and Edward Grey to have a high-level conference at Kiel. It didn't work out. Grey kind of diverted House to another topic. Now, initially, Wilson was very uncritical. He trusted House completely. He sent him to Europe with really, in many cases, no written instructions. And if the President had been, I think, less convinced of this sort of mystic union of thought and feeling with Colonel House, I think he might have been more careful in delegating authority and much more aware earlier of House's weaknesses as a negotiator. And I think it's important to remember that really early on, this was from the very start, this relationship between House and Wilson was a very fragile relationship. They never really saw that much of each other. House wintered in New York. He summered on the North Shore of Boston. He took these long trips to Europe. He never spent more than a few days in Washington visiting Wilson at the White House. The one time during the Wilson years he spent a week, but that was only because he had gotten the flu and he couldn't leave. On the one hand, he had achieved many of his, he had achieved what he'd always wanted. He was the close advisor of an American president. On the other hand, he discovered that he felt a fair amount of ambivalence in these days at the White House, because while they were exhilarating, while they were essential if he was going to retain his influence with Wilson, he also found them kind of confining and I think a bit oppressive. Because Wilson, who was accustomed, I think, to getting his own way, to dominating those around him, he wanted to bend House to his own routines. And so he wanted House to go to church with him. House normally avoided that. In one case, he sent his wife, Lily, instead. He wanted House to come to the golf course with him. House generally avoided that too. Though on one occasion, he walked with Wilson on the golf course and came to the conclusion that Cary Grayson was not trying very hard to play golf with the president. Wilson wanted House, for example, to take long automobile rides in the dead of winter, which House didn't relish either. And so, much as he was pleased to be invited to Washington, he was always eager to get back to his apartment in New York City. And then I think the height of the Wilson-House relationship probably comes in the fall of 1915. Because in December of 1915, Wilson remarries, and Edith, his second wife, is a very different person from his first wife, Ellen. And the whole emotional dynamic of this inner group around Wilson begins to change. Edith has an obsessive love for the president. She does everything with Wilson, unlike Ellen. And from the very start, from the summer of 1915, even before she and the president marry, she is critical of many, if not all, of Wilson's advisors. She's critical, for example, of Tumulty, more or less his White House chief of staff. She claims he's common. She's critical of Colonel House, though she's never met him, on the basis of some of his letters, which she thinks are kind of wishy-washy and weak. And Wilson, in the summer of 1915, when he gets these critiques from Edith, he writes what is the only long evaluation of many of his advisors and of Colonel House as well. And it's a remarkable letter that shows that Wilson really understood the kind of people he needed to draw around him if he was going to achieve his great political goals. Wilson remarks that yes, of course, tumulty is common, but then so are many of the people he has to deal with as president, and it's good to have an advisor who can handle him. House, he's convinced Edith is going to love House as much as she loves him, if only she will give House more time to win her affections. But there's no doubt about the fact that after his marriage in December of 1915, Wilson begins to very gradually pull back from his friendship with House. In fact, in early 1917, House has a great shock. He's talking to Edith and Wilson in the White House, and he brings up a subject that's come up I don't know how many times. What's going to be done with, what to do with Ambassador Page, who has become hopelessly pro-British. And Edith says, well, to Colonel House, why don't you go to London to replace Page? House is devastated by this comment. And Wilson says the same thing, why don't you go? The last thing House wants to do is go to London. In fact, not long after that, he does something that's really very out of character. I mean, his whole life has been built about this migratory routine, so he can avoid being certain places at certain times of the year, so he can relax when he wants to. And he gets so worried about his position with Wilson that he suggests to him that he move to Washington, actually move to Washington and become Wilson's chief of staff to organize all of the various things that are going on around the president. Wilson writes a letter back in which he's obviously baffled by this notion that after all of these years, after House never wants to stay more than 2 days or 3 days, and then why House suddenly wants to come to Washington to live, and nothing ever comes of this, obviously, but it's a sign that House is getting very, very uneasy about his relationship with the president. Now, I think that Wilson certainly realized that House lacked a first-rate mind. In fact, he always referred to the colonel as a counselor, not as a statesman. Wilson made a very, very sharp distinction between those two categories. But even after his relationship with House began to cool, House was very useful. He remained a key figure, and Wilson kept giving House more and more jobs. In the summer of 1917, he made him head of the inquiry to begin to plan the peace conference. In October of 1917, he sends House to the Inter-Allied Conference in Paris. In the summer of 1918, it is House that drafts that writes the first draft of the Covenant of the League of Nations. So House is just doing an awful lot of important things during this last phase of the friendship, and it's really only in the second half of the Paris Peace Conference that the relationship really begins to break down. But it's been breaking down for a long time prior to the peace conference. And that is because very gradually, as House goes on all of these missions to Europe, as he accumulates all of this power and recognition, he begins to move out of the president's shadow. After all, by 1917, by the time the United States enters the war, House knows many, if not most, of the leading statesmen of Europe, at least all of the leading figures in Berlin and Paris and in London. When he goes to Europe, he is treated as a head of state. He receives all of that kind of deference. And he gradually concludes that he knows more about what is going on in Europe than anyone else in the American government, including the president. And not only that does he know more, but that he also has superior diplomatic skills. And at one point, prior to the peace conference, when House is over in Europe, he's waiting for Wilson to come. He's unhappy about the fact that Wilson is going to travel all the way to Paris and that he's not going to stay at home in Washington. House writes in his diary that he can guarantee the results of the peace conference if only he can have Secretary of the Treasury McAdoo and Herbert Hoover as members of the American peace delegation. And so it's during the second half, really, of the peace conference that Wilson really loses confidence in Colonel House. And of course, after Wilson leaves Paris in late June of 1919, they never see one another again, and House enters into a new phase of his life. Now, just one other major theme of this book I want to look at very briefly And that is that there are lots of, Wilson assembles this small group of friends and advisors. And there are lots of tensions and changes within this group of advisors over the years. Just to remind you, it includes, of course, his first wife, Ellen, then Edith. It includes Joe Tumulty, of course, Colonel House, the White House physician, Cary Grayson, who at times lives with Wilson in the White House and becomes someone who acquires authority, or at least influence, beyond his role as a White House physician. Secretary of the Treasury McAdoo is one of these people. Wilson's second Secretary of War, Newton Baker. The speculator and financier Bernard Baruch perhaps becomes a member of this inner circle later on during the war years. And maybe I would include the journalist Ray Stannard Baker, who becomes Wilson's biographer, but who was also the chief press officer of the Paris Peace Conference and who keeps a remarkable diary for some of the Wilson years. And so over the years there's a constant maneuvering among this group of people to gain access to the president, to gain influence with the president as well. And what I find so amazing is that over nearly 7 years, given the small amount of time House actually spent with Woodrow Wilson, that he can maintain his position within this group of friends and advisors. And House had a complicated relationship with each one of these people. Let's just look very briefly at his relationship with one of these 8 people, and that would be William Gibbs McAdoo, who was Wilson's Secretary of the Treasury. Now, McAdoo grew up in Tennessee. He came to New York City in 1892, where he became a very successful businessman, and it was McAdoo's company that put the first railway tunnels under the Hudson River. But McAdoo, despite his success in the business world, longed for something more. There was an idealistic side in him, a concern for social justice, and he was drawn to Woodrow Wilson as a key figure in the achievement of these goals, and he became an important figure in the Wilson organization during the campaign of 1912. And as a result, he was rewarded with the position of Secretary of the Treasury, and he became the most dynamic and the most ambitious member of Wilson's cabinet. Now, House from the very start was impressed with McAdoo. He admired his energy, his imagination, his progressivism, but he also realized that McAdoo was a driven and a very emotional man. In fact, once House remarks in his diary after a long conversation with McAdoo that he's as emotional as a woman. He also realizes that if McAdoo is going to achieve his enormous ambitions, if he is going to maintain his emotional equilibrium, he needs help, and House nominates himself as the person who is going to become McAdoo's patron and give him the help that he needs. In fact, at one point, McAdoo actually has some insight into the imbalance in this relationship. He tells House, "I tell you everything I know, and you never tell me anything." But McAdoo's role became more complicated when he married Wilson's youngest daughter in May of 1914. Not only Wilson's youngest daughter, but his favorite daughter as well, even though McAdoo is 26 years older and has already raised a family. McAdoo, even after his marriage, he remains restless and ambitious. He begins to develop presidential ambitions even before the 1916 campaign. He becomes known as the Crown Prince. He is aware of many of the problems of President Wilson's health. And there's always this question, I think, of whether or not the president is going to be strong enough to run again in 1916. If he doesn't run, of course, McAdoo hopes that he is going to be the Democratic nominee. Well, in any event, House listens to McAdoo's complaints and to his aspirations. He tries to calm him down. He offers him by and large what is good advice, and he maneuvers at one point to avoid an open break between McAdoo and his father-in-law because Edith quickly decides she dislikes him. She feels McAdoo is selfish, that he's intrusive, that he interrupts Wilson at times when Wilson ought to be left alone. And so House maneuvers very successfully to avoid a break between the two men. And gradually, after 1917, McAdoo becomes less reliant on House, but he never does achieve his great presidential ambitions. Now, just to wind this up, during the Wilson years, House was very, very conscious of his place in history and of what his legacy was going to be. He realized, as did many of his close friends, that he had a problem because he had no official role, that his contribution was so intangible that it could very easily be lost with the passage of time. And so he wanted to make sure that this did not happen. And so in September of 1912, he begins keeping his diary, which is, by any measure, a remarkable document. And it took an enormous amount of discipline for House to maintain this diary for so many years. I mean, he had long, long days filled with phone calls and meetings and other conferences. And yet at night he would dictate his diary to his faithful private secretary, Fanny Denton, and he did that even during the Paris Peace Conference. The only times when he did not dictate his diary that very evening is when he was in Washington and when he would make notes, and then he would return to New York in a few days and dictate his diary entries. And so the diary gives us, for better or worse, his version of events. It gives us his version of his conversations with Woodrow Wilson. There's no other record of most of those conversations. It gives us his thoughts on the people and the politics of the Wilson era. And so House felt, as the years passed, that both his diary and his large manuscript collection would be enough for any future biographer. But then he began to think in the summer of 1916 that, well, maybe after all, that's not quite enough. He worried that the record about his childhood in Texas and his years in Texas politics was too thin. And so in the summer of 1916, he dictated a kind of autobiographical fragment called Reminiscences. And then it filled in many of the gaps, and then in 1929 he dictated another autobiographical fragment called Memoirs to kind of guide future historians when they ended up writing about him. Now I think House had good reason to worry about his fate at the hand of historians. His reputation did fade. It faded very rapidly after the Wilson years, and in the 1920s and in the 1930s, his supporters and those of Woodrow Wilson had a kind of battle of the books in which they engaged in quarrels over who was responsible for the successes and the failures of the Wilson presidency. House sought vindication through the 4 volumes of his intimate papers, which were published between 1926 and 1928 and edited by the Yale historian Charles Seymour in 4 volumes. Those were the great defense of his life and of his work. And Wilson, of course, probably the major work in the late 20s and 30s, and it was Ray Stannard Baker's multi-volume biographer, which drove House crazy, the way in which Baker treated him in those volumes, the way in which Baker's volumes were dismissive of House's role in the Wilson administration. But I think that all of these quarrels in the 1920s and the 1930s between the protégés of either Colonel House or President Wilson were really quite misleading. Because Wilson and House were certainly not antagonists. They shared the same beliefs and the same goals. They were, in fact, what I think was part of an extraordinary collaboration. And if Woodrow Wilson, as many people still think, cast a long shadow over the 20th and 21st centuries, and if his vision of the future, as George Kennan has remarked, still commands a great and commanding relevance for us, then I think that Colonel House deserves some of the credit for helping to make all of this possible. Okay, thank you very much. Questions?
Charles already identified me. I'm John Cooper. I have worked on Woodrow Wilson. Charles, I think you've hit upon and dealt with very well the central problem of House, which is that diary. As you said, for most of the time, we just don't have much else. Now, what's interesting in the peace programs, just about everybody else is keeping diary, especially Baker and Grayson and several others. And Baker and Grayson are very important because, in fact, they're much more with Wilson than House is. So you're getting, in a sense, you can triangulate. For the first and I think the only time, you can triangulate House. And I would agree with you. House isn't making things up, usually. No. I think there are other times that you may do that. But at the same time, it comes down to that emphasis. And as you also point out, and I was very glad that you mentioned that letter to Edith, where that's the only time we have Wilson stepping back and talking about House. And one of the things that's bothered me is that just about every one, I've only found one other instance where Wilson talks about House as my second personality, or he speaks everything like that, except from House. Those all come from House. There's one time, it was William Rappard. I talked about him when I did something about, the Swiss here a couple of weeks ago. He does say, calls Rappard, this is in November 1918, consult with Colonel House, he's my alter ego. But otherwise, we're only getting that from House. And this is very, very troubling. And I think you deal with it quite well. What I'm a little troubled with, though, is, I've got a blurb on the back of the book, and I talk about House as say Charles Winnow's fantasy about the man whom contemporaries could call America's best diplomatic brain, that's Harold Nicholson, and also that devious son of a bitch, that's Josephus Daniels, Jonathan Daniels, Josephus' son. Now, some of us would say those are not necessarily incompatible, and I think there's a certain Secretary of State that might be described in those terms also. But House was really well hated. He was really well hated in that Wilson circle. And for good reason, because he intrigued against them constantly. Daniels, Baker, Bryan. Another thing that's interesting is I've only found one instance of Wilson knocking Bryan outside of House's diary, outside of what House says. And in fact, there are several instances in other cases where Wilson is springing to Bryan's defense. So, these are I think, are real problems with dealing with the man and trying to get some view of him except through his own eyes. But I congratulate you on doing such a splendid job with it.
Thank you, John. Let's just come back to the Bryan. You mentioned Bryan, and that's really very interesting because Bryan is an example of how cynical and manipulative House could be. There are many. Until Bryan resigns as Secretary of State in June of 1915, House sees a lot of him. He'll normally talk to Bryan when he goes to Washington, and House is very friendly with Bryan's wife, with his daughter. He's known him for many years. Bryan, at times, if the diary is to believe, confides in House about his health, his aspirations, about the fact that he's gained too much weight and doesn't know how to take it off. And all the time, and in fact, on at least one occasion when House goes to Washington and he doesn't want to stay in the White House, he stays with Bryan. And yet, while House is cultivating the Secretary of State, he's working, as you say, John, relentlessly to undercut him behind his back. He goes to Europe. One of the first things he tells Sir Edward Grey is that Bryan really is not thought of very highly by the president. You shouldn't take anything Brian says very seriously. And he's absolutely relentless in trying to undercut Brian's influence. And yet, he's also kind of naive about what he puts in his diary, because he tells us all of this stuff. He tells us about all of these things he's doing with Brian, and then he also tells us how he's cynically trying to manipulate him. It reminds me of Lloyd George's comment that House wasn't half as clever as he thought he was. But often his behavior is really quite transparent.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lou Galambus, Johns Hopkins. And Charles, I love the biography. I read every word in it. It's big, as you know.
Could have been bigger.
Yes, I know that. I particularly love the part about Texas politics that you played down here, but I just thought it was great. You know, we were both in Texas, and so maybe that's why. But the part that interested me was carrying over the view of politics from Texas to international relations.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought you were very honest about House's limitations in this regard. I thought you could have stamped a little harder. Of course, I disagree about entering into the First World War, as you know. I think that House led down that line toward the war, I thought, in part because of the way he dealt with politics and with international relations.
What you're saying, Lewis, the way he wanted to move us into war is related to the way he behaved in Texas politics?
It was intensely personal view of politics.
Yes, yes.
And of how the political process works.
Right.
And while that was fine for Texas politics, worked pretty well for the presidency, some aspects of it, it didn't work very well in international relations.
No, I agree. Yeah, and so he ends up emphasizing way too much individuals and what individuals can accomplish within these belligerent governments, and he doesn't. He never understands the kind of structure within which they operated, or the kinds of historical forces they had to deal with. And that's why I said that his preparations were sometimes quite careless. But that's a good point. He was also a man he was a man who learned through his ear primarily, not through what he read. And for example, once when he was preparing for, I think it was his first trip to Germany, he knew there was a good chance he could see the Kaiser. So he calls in, I can't think of his name now, some American professor who's just been over there. And they talk for, I don't know, 3 or 4 hours, and then House concludes, well, now I have a good grasp of what the situation is going to be like in Berlin. And he's ready to go.
He didn't need a State Department.
No, but he's also quite shrewd in some ways. You know, I make this remark about how, you know, as the United States gets more and more involved in all of this, you need a certain apparatus to get things done. And House begins to assemble this. You know, he draws, again, he's a nepotist, so he draws in his son-in-law, Gordon Norton-Klaus, who becomes one of his staff members. His brother-in-law, Sidney Macy's, becomes head of the inquiry. And then he's always got one of his people in the Department of State, so he'll be able to influence things there and find out what's going on. That happens to be later on Frank Polk. And then of course he he draws in the young Englishman, William Weissman, who becomes virtually a son, and someone who helps him maintain this very vital Anglo-American connection. So, but in terms of, in certain ways he's really doesn't understand what's going on.
Thank you. Don Wolfensberger?
Don Wolfensberger with the Wilson Center. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned in passing the novel that House wrote, I think it was during the first decade of the century. Some have attached significance to it in terms of how he envisioned himself, what he wanted to be, as well as society. I believe somebody had called it a utopian
Yeah, for sure.
novel. Could you tell us how true you found that to be, as in terms of what he wanted to be, what he wanted society to be, and how did his vision, I guess, of society parallel or differ from what Wilson saw as a progressive?
He wrote Philip to administrator during the during the early months of 1912, when he was in Texas. I think he wrote it because House went through, I didn't talk about this today, House actually, like Woodrow Wilson, he went through in the years, I don't know, 1908, 1909, around in there and beyond. He went through a kind of progressive transformation in which he became swept up in many of these progressive issues. And but I think he was worried about how he would be viewed by the new president. That he was worried about that the legacy of being established not only established his progressive or even his radical credentials, but he also, I think, wanted, House always had a kind of fantasy life, which is hard to get at. He once, the journalist Lincoln Colcord was a protege of his, and once he had a long conversation with Colcord in which he said, you know, sometime the day may come when I'm going to turn on all of these people in the power establishment, and I'm going to tell the public what I know. In other words, I'm going to tear apart the political system which I've helped to construct. And so Philip drew is, I think, this kind of, in many ways, fantasy novel in which the young military officer takes control after a great battle, enacts a series of sweeping reforms, has a romantic relationship, and then fades into the sunlight. It was very typical of utopian novels, romantic novels of that period. Then he gives a copy to Woodrow Wilson after Wilson's elected, and before Wilson goes on vacation to Bermuda, and I think big mistake. I can't imagine what Wilson must have thought of that novel if you actually look at it.
Thank you. I think Sam Wells.
Please. Sam Wells here at the center. Charles, you talked very effectively about how House and Wilson began to drift apart after the marriage with Edith. What I'd like you to speak about is when Wilson, in the course of these European missions, began to feel that House was not telling him the full story, or that he was withholding things, or even not representing Wilson's views adequately, sort of starting with the House Gray Memorandum and going through allied treaties and secret agreements and a whole range of things. But how did that evolve while Wilson still keeps giving him extra jobs?
Yeah, good question. It's kind of hard to pin that down too, except, one of the reasons Wilson, not initially of course, but later on in 1915 and after, one of the reasons Wilson wants House to go abroad is to really give it to British leaders, to really protest the way in which the British blockade is infringing on American rights. And House doesn't really do this. He goes through the motions, but he's not going to have a big fight with Grey or Balfour or these other leading British statesmen about the blockade. He always kind of sidesteps it. Then when is it? I'm just thinking. It may be it's a 1915 mission. House goes to England first, and then he's got to decide when he's going to go to Berlin. And the British don't much want him to go to Berlin for one reason or another, and so House kind of stays in London. He's an accommodating guest. And Wilson becomes very impatient with him and says, when are you leaving? Shouldn't you really decide this on your own? But in general, I find Wilson does become, I think, increasingly impatient, as Wilson himself begins to pay much more attention to the European war and to the challenges it presents to the United States. But even so, I find the fact that Wilson is willing to give House so much autonomy, mission after mission, year after year, somewhat puzzling. And in part, I guess, it's because Wilson really, as things work out, doesn't have anyone else to turn to. I mean, if he were to cut House off, who is he going to use for these diplomatic initiatives with the European belligerents? He has no confidence in his Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, no confidence in his ambassador in Great Britain, no confidence in his James Girard, his ambassador in Berlin, none in his ambassador in Paris. He's got really no alternative to relying upon the colonel. But I do think he becomes increasingly impatient. And that kind of breaks, on occasion, that impatience will break to the surface. For example, in the late fall of 1918, the House makes it very clear he wants Wilson to stay in Washington during the peace conference. Or at most, he wants Wilson to come over, make a symbolic appearance, and then return. And then let House become head of the American delegation. And when Wilson gets that message from House, he is really, really very upset. And he says that I am coming, and I am going to be head of the delegation.